Hey everyone, I'm back. Professor Sigrist here to continue discussing Edmund Burke. We've been discussing Burke in relation to Rousseau and in the context of the French Revolution and the rise of modern ideology, left and right, in that context, with, you could say, especially the Jacobins and the French Revolution and the reaction to the French Revolution, the negative reaction to the French Revolution in Europe and England, Britain, and the United States, the early United States. Um, and we've been talking about the Burke's book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, talked about nature, social contract, and political society established by the contracts, which Burke presented implicitly in Reflections on the Revolution in France. But we had left off there, and I want to spend the rest of our discussion on the reflections, focusing on Burke's views of politics, rights, and progress. So, if you wanted to point to one sort of general feature distinguishing Burke from the French revolutionaries, one of his key critiques of them was that they were reductionist and simplistic. He insisted that human nature, rights, and society are much more complex matters than the revolutionaries acknowledged or recognized. And so let me just take some of those factors. Start with reason. So, Enlightenment reason, Burke thought, I mean, of course, it wasn't really called Enlightenment reason then, but it was reason in the context of the Enlightenment, reason with a capital R. It had become sort of almost apotheosized, or however you say that, by the French revolutionaries. They actually eventually made the Cathedral of Notre Dame into a temple of reason, so literally almost worshiping reason, human reason, meaning, and more specifically, Enlightenment reason. Burke thought their notion of reason was much too abstract. He called the kind of reason characterizing the French Revolution as naked reason, reason stripped of prudence, of sense of the cultural and other circumstances that have to be taken into account when you're trying to apply reason to human affairs. That word prudence is critical for understanding Burke in general. The notion of prudence, I mean, the classical notion of prudence was the ability to apply universal principles to the particulars of circumstances. And while the principles were universal and essentially fixed, the application always would take different forms, because what a principle requires in a certain particular circumstances might be quite different from a different circumstance, right? And prudence was the ability to recognize how to apply those. Burke doesn't talk as much in terms of applying principles, but there's this notion of prudence as a kind of rational sensitivity to what is required in the circumstances. And he said the French revolutionaries lacked prudence. Um, for example, he pointed out that. Well, let me flesh out prudence a little bit more too. So, I mean, naked reason was stripped of. If you wanted to sum it up in Burke's terms, it was stripped of moral imagination and not rooted in experience or tradition. And so, just elaborate on those terms. So, by moral imagination, Burke meant things like the gentlemanly ideal coming out of Western civilization, coming out of medieval Christian civilization. So that's one of the way Burke sort of described Western civilization, European civilization, is as a product of Christianity and the chivalric ideal. The chivalric ideal being sort of rooted in that, that notion of the noble knight protecting the innocent and so forth. And so there's a kind of image of what chivalry means and the right way to treat people and so forth. And there's other kind of ways, forms that moral imagination can take, but that's the specific form it took in Christian European civilization. And Burke says you really need that kind of sensibility. Reason and, and by the same token, you need traditions to sort of root reason in a more concrete form. So he says, I mean, naked reason is naked because it's sort of acting on its own, like as if in a vacuum, without the support of moral imagination and without the support of uh, long experience and established traditions, which often sort of um, include a kind of sort of unspoken rationality. There's one of the reasons that traditions are long, or at least good traditions, and he does make this distinction because not all tradition is bad. There are bad traditions, but there are also good traditions. And in the good traditions, there's a lot of latent wisdom. Um, Traditions are developed out of a process of trial and error, and one of the reasons traditions last, or again, we're speaking of good traditions here. One of the reasons they last is because they've been tried and tested and have stood the test of experience. So even though people don't necessarily think about the reasons behind the way things are done, they said they're done that way oftentimes because of a lot of trial and error that we've forgotten. You know, um, from time immemorial, it was the common phrase. And reason acting by itself is, well, first of all, it's too much to ask of human reason to think everything through on your own. I mean, the Enlightenment included the idea of think for yourself, which is good up to a point. But the idea is, if you had to think through the reasons for every single thing you did, you'd be paralyzed. It's not practically sufficient. More practical is to, accept the traditions that are handed down unless you have a clear good reason for um, rejecting it. So I mean, why wring your hands struggling to think of the rational basis for what you're going to do if there's no clear problem with it. And so his idea of reason, Burke's idea of reason, is prudence supported by moral imagination and tradition and experience. So just to give you an example, like one of the things he was critical of about the French National Assembly that was established early in the French Revolution was that it was full of people who had no political experience. There were lawyers, there were all manner of people in there who had their own areas of expertise, but they'd never been involved in politics before, and they're kind of winging it, because what else? What other options do they have? And they at the same time they had this very optimistic view of enlightenment, and that everybody could be enlightened, everybody could equally sort of have a good understanding of things just by using their old noodle, and that was for Burke unrealistic, and their lack of experience, he was sure, would lead them astray. They didn't understand the messiness of politics. They didn't understand the give and take required. They didn't understand that usually there's no like ultimate solution to problems. There's trade-offs, um, and that kind of thing. I mean, all of which requires prudence to manage, right? And he just didn't think there was prudence. In addition to this lack of political experience, a lot of revolutionaries were relying on sort of schemes of political, ideal political systems concocted by philosophers who were essentially public intellectuals, maybe not philosophers in the classic sense, but they thought of themselves as being philosophical. But they've been sitting in their studies, imagining sort of the way society should be, and they have no sense of sort of the inevitable messy realities of politics in terms of interactions with people who naturally, Burke thought, will have different interests, different concerns, and so forth. And so that's the notion of reason that Burke presents, and that it's a kind of rationality that the French revolutionaries lacked. A second thing relates to that understanding of rights. Rights, Burke suggests, are a much more complex matter than presented by the French revolutionaries. The big slogan was liberté, égalité, fraternité, which means, liberty, equality, and brotherhood, or, sociability, or something like this. But those are very abstract content. What does that mean in practice? And so Burke says, yes, there are natural rights. They're sort of pure and pristine in the abstract, but to be any good in the real world, they have to be made concrete. And he said, it's as if, this is a great image, it's as if natural rights in their purity hit this, this dense medium of the concrete political world, and it's refracted light, just like light would be refracted in water. And so if those principles of justice are not made concrete, they're no practical good, and trying to sort of apply them in an absolute way, in their purity, you're going to cause more harm than good, he thought. And you might connect this with the Declaration of Independence. So if you look at the often neglected middle section of the Declaration of Independence, maybe you could see what's different about the American Revolution and the French Revolution as somebody like Burke would have seen it. You have at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence this abstract statement of principles, which is beautiful and compelling. All men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, et cetera, et cetera. But they are abstract. In the middle section of the Declaration of Independence, you have this sort of catalog of concrete rights that have been violated by King George, they say. So things like elected legislatures, trial by jury, all these sort of practices and institutions where those abstract rights have been brought down to earth and have taken concrete form that is reliable and workable, right? And so, again, the French revolutionaries are too abstract, and they're simplifying the question of rights too much. So Burke's idea of liberty and equality, so liberty for Burke is often put in terms of ordered liberty. It's not license. It's not anything goes, which was the tendency that was starting to happen in terms of how you understood personal liberty. But liberty, to be healthy, needed to be properly constrained by sort of moral self-government, law, and it needed to be rooted in traditions and practices and institutions, or else it's not very meaningful. Again, equality. Burke said this understanding of equality as the French revolutionaries were in terms of leveling, socioeconomic leveling was not the right kind of equality to focus on. Um, Burke says, that's a question. I brought this up before in the last lecture, how you understand conservatives and liberals slash progressives in the American context, which is largely liberal, right? Again, the American conservatives are largely within the liberal tradition, right? Going back at least to the Magna Carta and to some classical roots and so forth. Um, you know, there are conservatives on the fringe that maybe don't fit, but for the most part, they're within the liberal tradition. But the difference, so the difference between conservatives and liberals slash progressives in the American context is not whether liberty and equality are important. They're agreed on that. The question is, what kind of liberty, what kind of equality, how do you understand their practical implications? How do you understand their relation to each other, et cetera? And Burke wanted to stress that socioeconomic equality is not the decisive question. The decisive question is equality under God, by which he meant especially kind of a moral equality. Equally under God's judgment, you could say. We're accountable to a higher authority, and equality under the law. He thought if you have equality under the law, if the laws are equal, if they're equally applied, that's what you need. So if you want to compare it to a classical precedent, you could think of Aristotle's Critique of Communism in Book Two of the Ethics. He's critiquing something in Plato's Republic, which um, may or may not have been meant seriously. It's kind of a thought experiment of Plato's, but Aristotle says the real problem in human society is not the way things are organized, although organization can help, right? The real problem is vice, you know, moral corruption, which is starts within, right? So Aristotle suggested no matter how well you organize property, if people are corrupt, you won't be able to save that society. So, so this focus on externals and prioritizing that over internals, that was Aristotle's point. And I mean, in a sense, Burke is saying the same thing. That's right. Um, you have this notion that all your problems will be solved if you can just organize property relations better, make better property arrangements, and so forth. But it actually won't solve your problem, even if you could pull it off. Then, in terms of Burke's understanding of civil government, based on you have this notion of rights, but the purpose of civil government, Burke says, and this puts him a little bit at odds with the American founders, although not completely. Um, but he says the goal of civil government is not to secure abstract natural rights, but rather a very wide ranging, the very wide ranging concrete benefits of society, all of them, science, technology, everything else, some of which don't really involve, you know, um, protecting people's rights against government and other forms of domination, and so forth. Um, the purpose of government is to secure a whole range of goods, which can't be reduced to rights, first of all, and to the extent they relate to rights, have to be very concrete. So, I mean, where the American founders would have agreed was that they would acknowledge that those rights need to be made concrete and weren't much good unless they were. So in that sense, the American founders were sort of hard-nosed realists, very practically oriented, and by the way, very often appealed to experience as a guide, and so in that sense agreed with Burke that you can't do without highly experienced people making decisions. It's not enough to just have some kind of ideal plan in your head and try to pursue that. You've got to be deeply experienced in politics and human affairs. Anyway, so the purpose of government is conceived differently. For the French Revolution, it was just strictly about securing natural rights in a sort of absolute way. At least that's the way Burke interpreted them. And then in relation to power, Burke really stressed the need to limit power. One of the things he was concerned about, and by the way, this was something that John Adams was very concerned about in terms of the French Revolution, was a lack of checks and balances. The National Assembly is, and then comes the National Convention and so on. It was essentially what we would call congressional government or parliamentary government, and it was strictly majority rule, and there were no internal checks. There was no check between legislative and executive power, uh, not to mention judicial power, and you know so look at John Adams to maybe make this very concrete in American context. John Adams had written a recommendation to American states after the Declaration of Independence, saying, "Hey, you need to make your own constitutions and so forth." And he sort of presented his suggestions for how to set up a government well. And he said it's not enough to have a democratic government. It's not enough to have a popular government because in the assembly of people who are elected, they, they're human beings just like anybody else, corruptible just like anybody else. The passions that would rule an individual or a small group are still there in a legislative assembly, uh, and majority tyranny is always a possibility. And so it's about Adams really stressed the lack of checks and balances in the government developing in the French Revolution. But that was a concern for Burke too. He mentions that government limited by some kind of checks and balances, some kind of arrangements that would provide limits, but also um, checks in terms of law and as in terms of higher law, like some standard above that would be that would um, limit even what the majority would contemplate doing. Then finally, Burke presents a kind of conception of progress that's different. Remember, I suggested this about, think about conservatism and liberalism or progressivism, that there is everybody likes the idea of progress in the sense that everybody would like to improve things. The question is how this progress is conceived. And for Burke, it was what he used the phrase conservation and correction. That's the right kind of progress. He acknowledges if society doesn't adapt to various to changing circumstances, it dies. Like any organism that fails to adapt. But there's a way to adapt, and there's a way to make change that is likely to be more productive and healthy, and there's a way not to. The French revolutionary approach of total revolution, let's just throw the whole thing out, all of our traditions, all of our political structures, and you just throw them out and start over. That to Burke would cause more harm than good. I mean, Burke would definitely be an adherent of what Voltaire described as Voltaire said, "Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good." That is to say, if you got something pretty good, don't throw that out for the sake of trying to achieve perfection, because first of all, you won't achieve perfection. That's not in the cards. And secondly, you'll probably you'd be giving up a lot of good things that you didn't even appreciate, you didn't realize the full significance of, and you won't be able to build up something as good as that. So not only you throw out the perfect, you throw out the good too. And so Burke's idea was, you need to conserve the good things in tradition. There's always good things that our ancestors passed down to us. The question is, having good judgment about what those things are. You want to conserve those good things and build on them, and correct them where they're off. Right? Burke totally acknowledges there are always things not right. There are always things deficient or problematic about what we inherit. But the idea is we need to correct those things. So you could call this a preference for reform rather than revolution. And Burke's notion, also, by the way, of what needs to be conserved was pretty expansive. It's all civilized achievements, basically. So, conserving the achievements of Western civilization, conserving the achievements in his context of um, English history and that whole tradition of liberty in England, um, looking to Europe, the civilizational achievements in Europe and in France in particular. I mean, he would point to certain things in France. Now, somebody like Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, who very much didn't like the French Revolution, wrote this book, Democracy in America, based on the fact that American democracy seemed, compared to France, to work pretty well. Tocqueville had lived through more than one revolution, and we're now in the Fifth Republic of France, and things just hadn't worked well. Certainly didn't achieve success right off, and Tocqueville wanted to see why American democracy worked pretty well, and he agreed with Burke that um, the French Revolution made a mistake in trying to completely overturn anything. But he did critique Burke for he thought Burke was a little too optimistic about what came before. I mean, Tocqueville was a little more critical about the feudal order established there, and some very sort of the depth of some of the problems, and so on. But in any case, I think it would help to get a full sense of Burke's notion of progress to look at how he looked at different revolutions. So, I mean, the French Revolution he rejected because it was a radical, total revolution, right? But he was a Whig who celebrated the Glorious Revolution, as it's called, where William and Mary came over and established, or reestablished, is the key point, reestablished a constitutional monarchy. So Burke looked at the Glorious Revolution as kind of restorative, um, reclaiming some positive developments, achievements, such as balance between king and parliament, and so that's a good revolution. Then with the American Revolution, and here's a kind of paradox. Burke looked at the American Revolution as a kind of conservative revolution, and that how can you have a conservative revolution? Well, the Americans declared independence, and they made their grievances known, and fought the revolution because they thought the British government was trying to take away good things that they already had. So they were trying to conserve something, right? In that sense, so the Americans had no notion of like, let's just transform society. Let's sort of establish a wholly new culture, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for one thing, they didn't have the problem of a feudal society. That wasn't really ever part of the American experience in the first place. But in any case, the you could say Burke wasn't against revolution per se. It depends on what kind of revolution it is, and so I mean that gives you a sense of the scope of the kind of conservation and correction he had in mind. It might call for, really, I guess, forceful uh, action, and it might involve sort of very serious action like a war or something. But that didn't mean total revolution. So that's the notion of progress. Um, Let me just finish out my discussion of Burke by pointing to what he said about the French Revolution in another work. He wrote several works that touched on the French Revolution. One of the most interesting ones was, outside of the reflections, was his letters from a regicide peace, which was written after the terror. So remember, the reflections of the revolution in France were written early in the French Revolution and surprised a lot of people because it was such a fierce attack on a revolution that a lot of people thought had the goals of the American Revolution, that kind of thing. After the Reign of Terror, when a whole lot of people had turned against the French Revolution and sort of were just in a state of shock about how bad things had gotten, Burke writes this afterwards. And what the interesting thing about these letters from a regicide peace is that it's a kind of critique of ideology, more sort of directly. So he describes what the French Revolution had produced as an armed doctrine. He says there's something new in the world. What we have here is a kind of fanatically aggressive idea system being promoted. And, and this is really, I think you could say, Tocqueville used the term, this is a new kind of religion. That's how he described the, there's a call from my wife coming in. I'll call her back. But lost my train of thought there. Tocqueville had described what was happening with the French Revolution as a new kind, a radical new kind of religion. So it had its own sort of doctrines. It had its own vision of sort of perfection at the end of time. If you think about the Christian idea of history and stuff like that. So both Burke and Tocqueville is sort of zeroing in, pinpointing what they think is unique and different about this. It has this revolution has a very religious quality, if you will. But Burke summed up the sort of key tendencies as three, involving three things: what he called regicide, Jacobinism, and atheism. And the way he describes these, it captures something of what we come to call leftism. So the idea of regicide was not just killing a king, or opposing monarchy. Of course, in the French Revolution, they had beheaded King Louis the 16th. But it was not simply opposition to monarchy that Burke was concerned with, but an idea that the only legitimate government is a democracy. And he thought that's a recipe for disaster. And first of all, that would make, at the time, that would say all regimes in the world are illegitimate. So, and which, of course, that has really radical implications. And Burke was, sort of in line with the classics and in line with Rousseau, by the way, thought that, democratic government requires certain preconditions, requires certain circumstances. And even if it's even if a popular government is conceived as sort of the, the best case scenario, it's not always possible, and it's not always best under the circumstances necessarily. So this sort of radical democracy that he saw in the French Revolution was one of the characters that we call that regicide. And then Jacobinism, the Jacobinism plank was leveling. That any form of inequality is ipso facto, something to get rid of. And Burke rejected that. The problem is not inequality. The problem is what kind of inequality are you dealing with? Because there are all kinds of inequalities in any society, including he thought, unequal opinions about right and wrong. For example, some people's thinking about justice, for example, is much more mature and much more accurate and that kind of thing than others. Um, Property arrangements, trying to redistribute and equalize property would again cause a lot of damage, and so on. This leveling tendency he called Jacobinism. And then the atheism plank or the atheism tendency, these three tendencies, uh, was that this attack on religion involved in the French Revolution. But again, he's sort of presenting this as a tendency, a modern tendency, not restricted to the French Revolution, right? Um, so implicitly, it's attacking. I think you could put this more broadly as it's an attack on any standard higher than the human sovereign, and in particular, in this case, the people. So the people are the absolute, and the will of the people, and the you know, uh, practically speaking, this often comes down to the majority of the people, but it can't be a minority of people speaking on behalf of the people, like Robespierre thinks that he understands this mysterious general will or whatever. But the idea that there's no standard above human government, law, leaders, etc., by which they can be judged is a further tendency. So this is what he's describing. What Burke is describing is ideology, a system of ideas that is, to use a term somebody else used, immanentized. There's no sense of a transcendent order um, that is radically egalitarian and radically democratic, um, which is leftist ideology, right? It's rigidly what's ideological about it, I would say, is that it's a kind of rigidly closed system. These points are sort of dogmatically and rigidly insisted on, and it results in not only inflexibility but all kinds of ignoring and destruction of realities that are necessary, inevitable, and necessary to be acknowledged. All right, so let me just end by I've been taking Rousseau and Burke in the context of sort of, or as examples, sort of founders of the rise of the left and the right. Um, with the caveat on Rousseau, let me point out that, I mean, this is not in the context of the Marxist tradition. Marx, of course, comes later. And so I would describe Rousseau as more left liberal than, say, leftist in the Marxist Leninist sense. But let me sort of sum up conservative ideologies in the American context, and or at least as they developed, and then a quick word on leftism, which I will flesh out more in discussions of Marx and in chapters you can read from my book on jihadist ideology. But in the American context, you, the first kind of ideological development for conservatism, which was never really sort of a coherent sort of package until in the 20th century. It starts with sort of anti-New Deal conservatism. Remember, conservatism is trying to conserve something against something perceived to be threatening to it. And the early spokesman for this kind of conservatism was Herbert Hoover, who wrote some really interesting things, uh, some interesting sort of presentations of what we call conservative philosophy. But of course, first of all, he was kind of a voice crying in the wilderness. There was no sort of movement involved that he was part of. And of course, he, in the minds of many, was the one who caused or failed to prevent the Great Depression, and so he lacked popular standing. So his writings at the time didn't have much of an impact. But he wrote two essays, one called "Rugged Individualism," about this self-reliant element of American character, and we call the fifth freedom, which was economic freedom. It's responding to a speech by FDR called "The Four Freedoms." I won't go into all of that. I just want to give a quick overview, but that's kind of how conservatism as a sort of coherent sort of idea develops in America. But it's in the context of the Cold War that it really congeals into a movement. And the Cold War framework, or the three components of conservatism, were libertarianism and traditionalism. And what what most united them was an opposition to the Cold War, but also to what the Cold War represented, they thought, in the United States. The opposition, they had less in common with each other in a sense than a common opponent. The common element was opposition to a meddling, activist, left liberal government and a preference for a more limited government. And this combination of libertarianism and traditionalism was sort of given the term by one of the intellectuals of the movement of fusionism. By the way, the movement sort of came together through William F. Buckley's National Review magazine. But this sort of coalition, uneasy coalition between libertarians and traditionalists, traditionalists being more in the Burkean mold, right? Libertarians here emphasizing especially economic freedom as their main concern. Since the Cold War, especially, was the glue that held them together, once the Cold War was won, I mean, once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was that glue disappeared, right? So they're sort of undermined by their own victory in the Cold War, and then conservatism fragmented quite dramatically in the decades to come. So you end up with a whole lot of conservative factions, sort of more narrowly focused and not always sort of cooperative. The main point, though, in our context, I want to point out is sort of the phenomenon of ideological hardening. So I suggested Burke is, in a sense, an anti-ideologue. I mean, he was wanting to oppose this tendencies, ideological tendencies towards sort of rigid adherence to abstract ideas, with a kind of fanatical, aggressive, crusade to push your ideological system. But conservatism too can become an ideology. I mean, to the extent Burke was a conservative is that he was trying to conserve something, right? But maybe it wasn't an ideology at that point. But any sort of presentation of ideas can become an ideology to the extent it becomes a sort of closed system. And this happened to some degree with both libertarianism and traditionalism. And as I said, you got many other versions of conservatism that don't fit neatly in these categories. But with libertarianism, the ideological hardening is kind of that economic freedom becomes a kind of panacea for everything. The free market will solve everything. And if there's, if anybody says that it won't, it's kind of like the socialist mantra that, well, it's never been done right. It's never really been tried. So, the solution is taken for granted. And evidence sort of fit into that theoretical presupposition a lot of times. But and then traditionalism sometimes becomes an uncritical acceptance of certain traditions. And in the American context, it sort of narrowed down from an appreciation for the achievements of Western civilization and Anglo-American civilization and so forth to particular issues. And it came to be called social conservatism in the United States. And I'm not saying anything about the policy concerns or whatever per se, but you kind of had, these one issue voting groups and so forth, but a sort of narrowed horizon of political concern that sometimes developed into you could say, an ideological faction. On leftism, last word, the trajectory of leftism in the United States, I'll just point out, and then again, we'll take up the latter part when we discuss Marxism, but the trajectory was sort of a New Deal liberalism, with a confidence in the welfare state as being able to solve, national problems, and looking to the state more and more to be able to solve all those problems. To the trajectory is towards a more culturally oriented and increasingly neo-Marxist left, ending up with what today is sometimes called identity politics based on racial and gender categories. So if you think about Marx interpreted everything in terms of, class warfare and domination of one class over the other, and neo-Marxism sort of applies that, sort of goes beyond class and says, well, yeah, that's one form of oppression, but you also have racial, and first it started with sex, male over female, but then other genders as the gay, the transgender today, these different categories of oppression. Just sort of seeing society in, from a critical standpoint, I guess you could say, a reductivist perspective or oversimplified perspective, even if there's a kernel of truth and particular areas of injustice, but society seen through the lens of just oppressor and oppressed classes of people. So that's where leftism kind of goes in America, and well, I'll just leave it there. Thanks for listening again, and I will talk to you later. Bye.